Lesson 14 is Limp 4 Authentication, Register, Login, and Logout routes. We are going to add a new Git route. We're going to point it to a register controller that we're going to need to create in the NAT show. We're also going to add our first post route. This is also going to point to the register endpoint. That is okay to use the same endpoint as long as they are different verbs. Next, we of course need to create a register controller. Within our register controller, we're going to start by creating our show callback action. This is responsible for showing our auth registration form. Then we'll create our store method. We'll leave this empty, but this will be responsible for storing or creating the newly registered user to our database. After that, we're going to go to our resources, delete our home.blade.php, and then open up our register.blade.php file. We're going to start by removing the view component. We're not going to use it yet. After that, I'm going to just scaffold up a form. We're going to start by just adding a div with flex justify center, and then we're going to create our form. Notice the method is post, and later on, we'll add the action. Our form needs to line up with our database migrations or user model properties. The method is going to be post because we are storing. We're hitting our store callback. Then I'm just going to add the fields and then also some CSS. Again, the fields map with our user's migration, so I'm going to speed this part along. And as always, you can find the linked GitHub repository with the end result of all of this code linked in the description. And alas, we have a register form with 5 fields. With the form itself displaying, let's confirm we're properly submitting our form correctly. Within register controller, we're going to die and dump register. Then we're going to fill out our form. We hit our die and dump. So our register form is properly submitting data to the back end. Let's get a specific field value within our register form input. Now, this is a little different compared to a GET request. Remember that in lesson 4 or 5, we set up the ability to use dependency injection on a specific request argument. So we should just be able to inject email, right? Well, not quite. When we fill out our form and we send input data as a request, we cannot use dependency injection, unfortunately. You get this error. To get around this, we're going to do something a little funky. We're going to set up a wrapper to easily access our route context and ultimately easily access our request input data as well as other current route metadata. To do this, we're going to have to start by setting the app to our super global server PHP variable. That's $_server, the key of app, and we're going to set it as a reference to app. Then we're going to create this global function, if it doesn't exist, called app. And then we're simply going to return our super global's reference to app. After that, we need to actually add this special middleware method on our app. It's going to be called add routing middleware. This gives our middleware the ability to access our route context. And then we're going to move that app functionality, the instantiation of our global app method, directly above that add routing middleware. After that, we need to create a new middleware class. And we're going to call this route context middleware. Within this middleware, we need to set up the traditional invoke function that accepts the request and the handler. We'll import those above. But we're also going to use a third import, and that is going to be the route context. Using the route context, we can get the current route. After we get the current route, we'll check if it's empty. If it is empty, we'll throw an exception. Using the routes, we're able to create two global helpers. One is the global redirect, and the second is a global request input parser. These are both going to be support classes we can add. We'll start with the redirect. App support / redirect. First, we're going to use the PSR HTTP message response factory interface. This is going to act very similarly to our app support view class. And the function and the construct function, we're going to accept an instance of the response interface factory. Then we're going to new up or create a new response that is 302. That is expected redirect code. After that, we're going to define an invoke magic method, and it's going to accept where we are redirecting to, and then we are going to say this response equals this response with header location and then to, and then it's going to return the response. Once we have our redirect support class set up, we're going to go back to route context middleware and bind the redirect class to our app or our app's container. It's going to be an anonymous callback function, and we have to import response factory and then new up a redirect class with that factory. After that, we'll return our handler and we'll handle the request. Then we'll test. To test this, all we need to do is we need to go back to our register controller store method, import the redirect class, and then set the variable to 2. We'll try return 2, and then we'll redirect back to our home page. Before we can actually use it though, we need to register the route context middleware. We'll go to our HTTP kernel and we'll register the route context middleware class within our web route group. After we register the middleware, we're actually going to add a global redirect helpers function. In app/helpers.php, we're going to check if the global redirect function exists. If it doesn't, we're going to define the global redirect function. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to resolve our redirect instance from our service container. After that, we're going to add the to parameter, set the resolved instance as redirect, and then return redirect to a given route. Back in our register controller, we can now replace the redirect to with the global redirect helper function, and then we can remove our import. When we resubmit our register form, we are successfully redirected. Before we move on, let's go to our resources, sections, navigation, and let's change these hashtags to actual routes. Now our routes will work in the top right. Let's move on to our route context middleware and set up our request input parser. What do we want this parser to look like? Well, in our request controller, or our register controller, we want request input, and we want to say input all. That will be an array of all input. We want to be able to forget our confirm password because that doesn't get saved to the database. And then we want to be able to access individual field values like email or first name. So using the request input, we'll say that's what we're going to make. We'll go to support and we'll create a new request input class. This is going to have two properties. The first is going to be attributes. This is going to be an array of our field keyed values. We're also going to add route metadata. To get this set up, we're going to need to create a constructor. The constructor is going to accept the request and the route. The meta is going to be primarily route information, the current route name, the current route groups, the current route methods, and the arguments for the current route. The only request metadata thing we are collecting is the current route URI, and that is from the request. After that, we're going to say this attribute equals get the request parsed bodies or default to an empty array. All right. Back in our route context middleware, we need to bind our request input class to a new instance of our support request input class. To create our request input, we need to new up a new request input instance, passing in the request and the route. We're also going to move this above the binding. So whenever we resolve it, we don't want to instantiate a new instance every time. We want to make it a singleton. It's going to be the same instance every time because our current route and our current request doesn't change within the scope of PHP's lifecycle. After that, we'll go over to our register controller. We'll use the request input. We'll simply try to access the request input attributes, which we can't because attributes is protected. To fix this, we'll go to our request input class and we'll add a all helper function. This will return all of our input values, keys to values. And then we can just die and dump the request input. Next, we'll go back to our register form, fill it out, and then we'll see our die and dumped form. Key to value, field to value. We're going to go to our request input class and we're going to add several helper functions. The first is going to be set. We can set or override attribute values. After that, we're going to use get. We can try to get one of our attributes by calling it as a normal property on the instance. If it doesn't exist, if the attribute doesn't exist and we try to get it, then we're going to simply throw an exception. Otherwise, we'll return the attribute property. After that, we're going to add an invoke function that allows us to easily access or get a specific property using our instance as a callback function. Then we're going to add a forget method. The forget method is going to allow us to forget a given attribute. After that, we're going to give ourselves the option to merge or set several values or fields on our request input. After that, we'll add this fill. This fill method is going to allow us to fill property values, but it won't override previously existing values. It does the same thing as merge, but if there's already a value there, it won't override it. After that, we're going to add a getter for each one of our meta route metadata. So get URI, get current route, get methods, get arguments, get whatever we need to get, just the route meta. These ones we won't access as much. Again, all of this is linked in the description below via the GitHub repository. All right. So now that we have that set up, we can access our input like this. We can say input password equals input confirm password. And we'll check if the passwords do match, if our input password is equal to our input confirm password, or more specifically is not equal to our input confirm password. Die and dump, password and confirm password do not match. We will come in later in a future tutorial and add more thorough validation, but for now, we'll just die and dump. Okay, after that, what we want to do is we want to say, since we know our password and confirm password exist, we can forget our confirm password. These are all just methods we just added. The password and confirm password are magic methods. The forget is actually a hard-coded method. Then we're going to say input password is going to be the input password but encrypted using SHA-1. After that, we're going to say if user where email equals the input email. This is the magic get method, by the way. This is why we can add or call properties directly. Exist, if the user where email equals input email exists, Then we don't want to create another user with a duplicate email, so we'll die and dump user with the input email already exists. It won't let us create it. Alright, given we get to this point, the password and confirm password match up, and we don't already have a user with the current email created, we'll say user force create, and then we'll pass in all of our remaining input. Again, we already ran the forget confirm password, so this is just first name, last name, email, password. We have to force create because our password is guarded within our user model. Alright, so this should properly work. Now once we create our user, we're going to have to log in the user, and then we're going to have to redirect the user to their home page. But for now, since we don't have that logic implemented, we're just going to die and dump the user themselves. And then we're going to redirect them to the home page. Finally, we need to remove that D and force created. We refill out the register form, and voila, we get the die and dumped user. Next, let's go back to route/web.php and create a new home endpoint. This is going to point to the dashboard controller home action. We need to create the dashboard controller, but this will be the user dashboard. Within controllers, we'll create our dashboard controller. After we create our dashboard controller, we'll create our home action. Then we'll say user is going to equal the current, we'll say the latest user, the latest created user. So to do that, we'll do /app/user latest first. This will get the most recent user. This is because we haven't set up our logged in or authenticated user. We'll do that next. Then we'll return our view, and we need to inject the view, and then we'll say view dashboard home, and then pass in the compacted user. Once we have that endpoint set up, we need to go to our resources views, create a new dashboard directory, and then within there we're going to create a new home.blade.php file. We're simply going to copy our welcome.blade.php, and we're going to add that as our home.blade.php. We're going to change the h1 tag to your dashboard, then we're going to say welcome user first name, and then comma last name. So welcome user first name, comma user last name, and then we'll call this the home dashboard. After that home dashboard is set up, we'll go back to our register controller and we'll remove our die and dump. We'll also remove this user equals. We don't need to set the user, and we'll redirect the user to the home dashboard. The home dashboard again gives the latest user, returns a view of the home dashboard, and passes in the latest created user. This will mock our login for now. After that, we'll fill out our register form, and voila, we're redirected to the dashboard page, and we properly see the user we just registered. Next, we're going to add a new support auth class. This will be responsible for logging in the user, verifying we're logged in or a guest, and then logging out the user. We'll add a auth class within app/support. We're going to add 4 methods. Attempt to log in using the email and password, log out, check if we're authenticated, and then determine if we're a guest. Those are our 4 methods. Let's start with attempt. These are all going to be static methods. An attempt is going to accept the email and the password. To start off with, we need to get the user where email is email. But this isn't actually an instance. This is still a query. So what we're going to do is we're going to say user exists. If no user exists, return false. The attempt to log in failed. Otherwise, say user is the first user. There should only be one returned user, but that's how we get a specific instance or record from our query. The query being user where email is email. Next, we're going to say if password does not equal user password, and then we're going to die and dump no password, or not the proper password. This is not going to be the actual password itself. This is going to be the SHA-1 encrypted password we're comparing. We need to compare the SHA-1 encryption password against the database stored SHA-1 encryption password. Nobody should ever actually know the real password. After that, we're going to set the user as the global super PHP variable, the session super PHP variable. And we're going to add the ID, the email, and the password, which is the SHA-1 encrypted password. If we get to that point and we set the session, we're going to return true. The attempt to log in the user with the email and password succeeded. After that, we're going to add or uncomment our logout method. All we're going to do with logout is we're going to set ID, email, and password. They're all going to be set to null. And then we're simply going to return self-guessed. The next method we're going to add, and we're actually going to have 5 methods, is we're going to have this user method. All user's going to do, and we'll add user in a sec, but all user's going to do is it's going to return the user based on the session values. So we're going to say query equals user where session user. So right here, this is going to be user where ID is the session user ID, where email is the session user email, and where password is the session encrypted user password. Then we're going to return the first user from our query if the query returns any result, if anything exists where the user ID or the user lines up with the session user variables. Otherwise, we'll return false. Then we're going to say public static function check and then public static function guessed. These will return, check will return true for authenticated, guessed will return true if we're guessed. They are the inverse of each other. Next, we're going to go to our config/app and add auth as a global alias. That way we can easily access the auth check and auth guessed and auth user within our blade templates. Again, config/app aliases. Auth equals the path to the auth class. After that, we're going to go back to our register controller, and we are going to make sure that we are encrypting our password before we save it to the database. Again, SHA-1 is the encryption algorithm. We are never passing around the actual password. This is, for example, and this is one of the simplest ways to set up an authentication system in PHP. It is not necessarily the safest. This is, for example, it works if you're in an enterprise application. I would not recommend this if it's a personal application. It's not the worst thing in the world, although it is definitely not the safest. Once we confirm we have SHA-1 set up and we are properly using that before we create our user, we're going to say user equals user force create and then auth attempt to sign in the user. And we're going to pass in the user email as the first parameter, attempt email, and user password as the second. Again, that password is the encrypted password. Alright, so now if we are able to find an email where the user email is the email, then we'll get it. After that, we say if the password does not equal the user password, die and dump not the proper password, can't log you in. Then, if we do have the proper password and the user does exist, set the session data for the user to the session key of user, and that is what we will use to query the current authenticated user. Back in the register controller, we can now remove the comments. And then remember, we redirect to home. Home redirects us to the dashboard controller home, and we're currently using the latest created user. Now we can use auth user, and it's just going to be auth and then the method of user and that will get us the authenticated user. Then we'll simply say use auth so we can get rid of that ugly backslash. After that, we can refill out a register form and we'll watch it fail. Why to fail? We don't have a global super variable called session. So to get this set up, we need to go to the very beginning of our application, public/index.php. We need to actually start our session. So to do that, within public/index.php, we'll simply say session start. And then we'll simply resubmit our register form, and voila, we are properly redirected to our dashboard with an actual authenticated user. Now that we have the ability to register though, we also need to add the ability to log in and log out. First, we'll add a get/login route that will go to our login controller that we have yet to make, and that will hit the login controller at show action. Then we'll create logout, and that will hit the login controller at logout action. We'll continue on and create our login controller. Our login controller will again have two methods. The first is going to be the public function show method. This will accept an instance of view and will simply return the view auth.login template. Next, we'll do the public function logout. This will call our auth alias and will log out the user. We'll then use auth at the top. That way we can remove the ugly backslash. Next, we'll confirm that we do have a guest, that we no longer have an authenticated user. We'll say if auth guest, return redirect to the login page. Once we have those login and logout actions set up, we need to create a new resources views auth/login.blade.php. We're going to copy our register.blade.php and use it as our login.blade.php with some minor refactors. We're going to change register to login, and then we're going to remove our confirm password, our first name, and our last name fields. The logout in the h1 tag should be login. That is a typo on my part. Once we have that set up, we're going to go back to our browser. Now we can properly hit our login page, and we'll try to log in. Here's a user I've already created. Notice this allowed memory size. This is an error that happens when the request is unable to be returned, whether it be a middleware or request. It says allocated memory size not enough. It's just a request wasn't able to be returned. Because it was never returned, it's basically an infinite loop kind of problem. In this specific instance, we actually don't have the ability to post to the login endpoint. Notice the method is post and that we have show and we have logout, but we never actually capture the login form data and attempt to log in the user. So we'll start in our login controller by adding the store method. We'll use the request input and we'll get the input email and we'll get the input password. And then we'll use our auth and we'll attempt to log in. If we successfully log in, then we want to redirect the user. And we're going to redirect the user to their home dashboard. Again, the authenticated user information is stored in the session, and that home dashboard is properly capturing the user that was logged in. If not successful, die and dump, unsuccessful login attempt. Again, we will correct this validation from using die and dump in later tutorials. After that, we need to go to web.php and we need to add our new route post. And this is going to be login, and then it's going to be login controller at store. So now we have login get, login post, logout get. Finally, within our login.blade.php, we need to add the action to hit the login endpoint. I also noticed that in our register, .blade.php, we didn't define an action, but it hit the proper endpoint. So I'm not sure if you need to add the action or not, but this will definitely make sure we get it working properly. Now if we try this again with an existing user, we will get not the proper password, can't log user in. What's going on? So before we can attempt to log in the user, we need to encrypt using SHA-1. Once we do that, auth attempt pass SHA-1, we get this. And now it does properly log us in, but if we try to log in again, it still won't work. Why? We need to go to our login controller, and when we go to our login controller, we're redirecting back to login. We need to redirect the user to home. Now if we try to log in one last time, it worked. So now we have properly logged in the user. For login, register, and log out routes working, we only have a few more things. First, let's do a minor refactor on our home dashboard. We're going to wrap the dashboard in a div with the class of flex justify center and then item center. And then within the inner div, we're going to make that wider. We're going to make it 5/6 of the total width. That will just make the dashboard better to look at. Next, let's go to our views, sections, navigation. And we're going to add a new link to our top right. We're going to call this the Logout Link. So it's just going to point to our logout page, and then it's going to simply have the text of logout. The final thing we want to do is we only want to show the ability to log out if the user is authenticated. So we'll do if auth check logout, else that means that we're a guest. We'll indent that and we'll say if we're logged in, show the logout route, else show the register and login route, because if we're not logged in, we must be a guest. We're going to go back, and when we reload this, we're actually going to break it real quick. And this was an error I didn't realize I did earlier. So what's going on? Well, check this. If we try to log in again, the links are properly hiding and showing at the top right, but if we try to log in, we get this loud memory error again. Well, it has to do with this check and this guest method. And so right now, if we do if auth check or if auth guest, depending on how we do it, if we invert them, then one works at a time. And so right now, because we're not logged in, if we do this, we reload after we invert these, and we change it to auth guest, it works, and sometimes it doesn't, and it gets really weird. So here's what's going on. If we go to auth and we go down and we go to our static function check and static function guest, we have to actually enforce that bool is the return type. And as soon as we type check these, now if we reload, it works. So now because we're logged in, all it was a logout route, and then once we're logged out as a guest, we'll only see the register and login routes. And we can go to register, we can go to login, and it works. As soon as we're logged in, none of those routes. As soon as we're logged out, you got register and login again. So guys, that is the basics of the register, login, logout functionality with the related navigational routes. Thanks for watching, and actually we're going to do one last thing. We're going to go to our top left .blade, and then we're only going to show the /home link if we're a logged in user, because you can't go to home unless you're logged in. So this gives us a little bit of protection on the front end. In the next lesson, we're actually going to add middleware that will automatically redirect users if they try to hit a given route and they don't have permissions. That way, it's just they can't see it, they can't hit it on the back end, and we'll be good to go. So guys, that is all I got for today, and this is Zachary Horn with Clean Code Studio. Clean code, clean life. If this was useful, enjoyable, you learned something new or cool, please, please, please like and subscribe. because these things, they're fun to make, but they take a while and they take a lot of effort. So that's all I got, guys. I appreciate you guys. Stay tuned for the next one. We're going to get into guest middleware and authenticated middleware, redirect if authenticated, redirect if guest. So clean code, clean life, simplify. Simpler.